The Odyssey of Miyamoto Musashi, Birth of a Legend. The story begins in the isolated, untamed terrain of Miyamoto Village, a place as harsh and unforgiving as the young man who called it home. He was known then as Takezo, a name that echoed his nature, a volatile, fierce, and untamed youth. He wasn't simply reckless. He was a coiled spring of desperate energy, yearning for an outlet for the fury that simmered within. His fractured world was dominated by his father, Munisai, a swordsman of fearsome reputation but deeply flawed character. Munisai was a shadow of greatness, and his son grew up in that shadow, desperate to escape it, yet equally desperate to inherit its lethal skill. Takezo's entire existence became a singular burning fixation, to find a true purpose, a validation that he believed could only be won in the screaming, bloody chaos of battle. The year was 1600, and the call of war provided the chance he craved. Blindly chasing the promise of glory, or perhaps just a meaningful death, he and his closest friend, Madahachi, joined the massive westward march. They were two naive youths running toward a destiny neither could truly comprehend. That destiny arrived in the form of the Battle of Sekigahara. It was not the noble stage of legend, but a hellish, overwhelming cacophony of chaos and crushing defeat. The Western army collapsed into a terrified, disorganized rout. The narrative plunges into the sheer, raw terror and survival instinct that consumed Takezo and Madahachi. They were no longer soldiers. They were animals scrambling through a nightmare, surrounded by the wounded, the dying, and the triumphant butchers of the Eastern Army. They managed a desperate escape from the field, only to face the immediate, brutal aftermath: the scavengers, the looters, and the executioners. It was in this violent wake that Takezo's fate twisted, his exhausted body captured and brought into the unconventional custody of the Zen Buddhist priest Takuan Soho. The priest, the rage, and the renaming. The confinement was not a traditional prison. It was a confrontation of wills. Takezo arrived in Takuan's temple a prisoner of his own rage, his spirit utterly resistant and untamed. He was a torrent of violence, struggling against the ropes that bound him, but Takuan did not fight fire with fire. Instead, the priest began a slow, subtle, and profoundly psychological campaign to restrain and civilize the young man. Takuan saw not a criminal, but a raw diamond, brilliant, but uncut and dangerous. The battle wasn't fought with swords, but with silence, patience, and penetrating insight. It was the beginning of the great mental war to transform the boy into a man. The climax of this period was the great formal transformation. Takuan, in a spiritual rite that broke the boy's identity to forge a new one, stripped away the savage name of Takezo and bestowed upon him the name the world would remember: Musashi. As Musashi emerged, a new poignant thread was woven into his life: Otsu, Madahachi's heartbroken, abandoned fiancée. She became a figure of silent, unrequited love, an enduring symbol of the life he chose to leave behind. She was his constant moral compass, representing the quiet, honorable goodness he struggled to attain. With the temple walls now behind him, Musashi formally began his legendary journey, the Musha Shugyo, the warrior pilgrimage. He was armed with a sword, but burdened by a newly conscious soul.
The way beyond brute force. The road was Musashi's new teacher, and his early travels immediately tested the thin veneer of Takuan's discipline. His pursuit of martial mastery led him to the famed Hozo-in Temple in Nara, a fortress of spear technique. The inevitable challenge and duel with the master, Ine, or his successor, Inshun, was a grueling, pivotal test. It was here, facing the dizzying linear thrust of the spear, that Musashi realized the limits of his sheer, reckless strength. The encounter forced a profound evolution. His technique began to shift, moving beyond brute force toward strategy and observation. He started to see the sword not just as an extension of his will, but as a tool of applied geometry and psychological insight. This shift was accelerated by unexpected encounters along his pilgrimage. Musashi found himself crossing paths with master artisans, meticulous calligraphers, and serene tea masters. These encounters were moments of quiet revelation, challenging his purely martial worldview and teaching him that the way of the warrior involved far more than simply fighting. He began a deliberate, solitary self-education, observing the perfection of a potter's form or the balance of an inked scroll, absorbing knowledge and wisdom from books and observation. Amid this growth, the shadow of the past returned. He crossed paths again with Otsu, and more painfully with Matahachi. Matahachi, now adrift and dissolute, served as a tragic counterpoint. This heartbreaking interaction starkly highlighted Musashi's relentless, difficult growth against his former friend's decline. It was a powerful, final affirmation of Musashi's solemn commitment to his lonely path, dedicating himself solely to the sword. The duelist in the capital. Musashi's journey culminated in the grand city of Kyoto, the heart of elite swordsmanship and the domain of the legendary Yoshioka school. He arrived not with humility, but with an audacious public provocation, his rough, untamed presence clashing violently with the entrenched arrogance of the dojo members. The first confrontation was a testing of the waters, a formal duel with a lower-ranking Yoshioka student named Rengoku-kan. It was a statement. The wild swordsman from the provinces had arrived. The stakes escalated with his challenge against Yoshioka Seijuro, the proud and skillful head of the school. The duel was a masterclass in technical differences and contained intensity. Musashi's shocking victory was a seismic event that instantly established him as a major but wildly controversial new force in the realm of the sword. But the school's pride demanded blood. The final, horrifying confrontation was a matter of survival. The duel against the entire Yoshioka faction, led by the determined young Denshiro, or Musashi's second duel with the school. This legendary chapter details the harrowing, desperate fight against dozens of opponents. It was in this moment of impossible danger that Musashi unleashed his true, revolutionary genius, revealing the technique of using two swords, the birth of the formidable Niten Ikki Ryu. He had transformed himself from a mere swordsman into an unstoppable force. The shadow of Kojiro and the silence of Ganryujima. The rise of Musashi inevitably called forth his true rival. Kojiro was introduced as a figure of aristocratic grace and lethal finesse, famed for his signature technique, the Tsubame Gaeshi, swallow reversal. Their styles were an elegant contrast. Musashi's was rough, battle-tested, Kojiro's refined and lethal. The narrative immediately established the inevitable conflict between the two supreme swordsmen. Their duel became a matter of destiny. The psychological build-up to the legendary encounter was a torment of logistics and anticipation. The stage was set at Ganryujima, Musashi's preparation was unconventional, a final act of strategic arrogance that bewildered his contemporaries. He intentionally delayed his arrival, and on the boat ride across the water, carved his massive wooden sword, a bokken, from a ship's oar. The story reaches its devastating climax with the detailed, moment-by-moment description of the duel with Sasaki Kojiro. Musashi's strategic delay was the first psychological blow, catching Kojiro off balance. He leveraged the environment, using the blinding sun to momentarily disorient his foe. The fight was brutally quick, one fatal, conclusive strike. The immediate aftermath was defined by Musashi's somber, silent escape and a profound, solitary reflection on the meaning of victory and defeat. He had won, but the cost of claiming the title of the greatest swordsman was a new, terrible loneliness. The Master and the Book of Five Rings. The final decades of his life saw Musashi transition from a wandering killer to a respected master. He was an invited guest, serving various daimyo like Hosokawa Tadaoki, taking on students, and finally settling into a life defined by disciplined contemplation, art, and philosophy. The final, most profound stage of his existence was spent in austere solitude in the Reigando cave. It was in this quiet darkness that the true master created his immortal legacy. The philosophical and strategic treatise known as the Book of Five Rings, Go-Rin no Sho. This work was the culmination of his entire life, translating the lessons learned on the battlefield into a universal philosophy of strategy, not just for war, but for life itself. The narrative concludes with Musashi's final transcendent thoughts on the way, life, and death. The violent youth had found his peace. His story ends with his peaceful passing and the confirmation of his lasting legacy. A man who mastered the sword, and in doing so, mastered himself.